All right, so in nature, there are four main processes that are mainly responsible for fragmenting this rock. Those processes are frost wedging, salt crystal growth, sheeting, and biological activity. In addition to these, the work made by erosional processes is related, although it usually is treated separately. They're usually treated as erosional agents. So these agents being mostly water and wind, and sometimes ice. So in the next few slides, we'll go over those four main processes that I just told you and that are on the slides that are responsible for the fragmentation of the rock. Okay, so we'll start with frost wedging. Frost wedging is the first process that we'll look at, and as an example to this, let's think of having a glass bottle that you leave in the freezer. The contents of this bottle are usually liquid, so this liquid will expand as it freezes, and consequently it will break the glass bottle, as it's shown in the image on the left. Well, water itself expands about 9% of its previous volume when it's frozen. The density of water is 1 gram per centimeter cubed, and that of ice is 0.9 grams per centimeter cubed. So there is less mass in ice than water for the same volume, or in other words, if a set mass of water is frozen, it expands in volume, okay? So hopefully that makes sense, but if not, go ahead and write it down. Again, density is equals to mass over volume, and so that way you could make that, that understanding. Okay, so the same thing happens when the water infiltrates fractures and cracks in the rocks. The water that infiltrates the cracks will expand when it freezes, and when it expands, it will enlarge the cracks and potentially fracture the rock even further, and hence start fragmenting, making it into smaller pieces. This feature or this process is called frost wedging. And then when the ice melts, the rock itself is more fractured and the remaining sediments are ready for erosion. The freeze-thaw cycle, also this is what the cycle is when there's freezing and there's thawing, and so you create more and more fragments season after season when you get this freezing and thawing occurring, or not even season after season. Sometimes this happens within the year itself, right? But the cycle itself takes place within the pores of the rocks as well, where the water is able to infiltrate. So it doesn't just happen in cracks and fractures, but also within the pores between each grain. So it makes the process go even faster. Overall, frost wedging causes a lot of the physical weathering that we see, especially in mid-latitudes where you get freezing temperatures. This is the main process, the main weathering process that's responsible for creating talus slopes, for example, as you're seeing them on the bottom right picture. Talus slopes are these slopes of loose debris at the base of cliffs for the most part. And as I said, they're very common in seasonally driven mountainous areas, like the ones that we have here in Idaho, for example. The picture that I have there is of Alberta, though, but you do see these if you go hiking pretty much anywhere in the National Forest area of Idaho. Another expansive force that can split rocks is created by the growth of salt crystals. This is common in rocky shorelines, for example. It starts when the seawater sprays and penetrates the cracks and the pores in between the grains and spaces within the rocks of the shoreline. And it also happens, for example, when salty groundwater penetrates through cracks, crevices, and also pore spaces inside of the rocks underground. As the water evaporates or simply flows through, in the case of the groundwater, the salt and other ions that are within the water, or were within the water, separate from the H2O component, and the salt crystals form in contact with the rock. So as they grow as they continue to grow even further, they weaken the rock that is surrounding it by pushing it apart or pushing the grains apart from the rest of the rock, and hence enlarging the smaller cracks that they were into, or simply just pushing the pores to be bigger. This process is common to occur in roadways and driveways, for example, where salt is spread to melt the snow and ice during the winter. What happens with the addition of salt is that it lowers the melting temperature, and once the ice melts, the water and the salt, the salt dissolves in the water, and then together infiltrate in any cracks that the driveway and roadways may have. These cracks may have formed initially by frost wedging, but then by the salt-water mix infiltration, once the water evaporates, the salt crystals will grow, expand those cracks, and fracture the driveway and roadways more. So I would advise that if you use salt to melt your driveway, you stop doing so because it may ruin it further in the future. Another process of mechanical weathering is sheeting. So sheeting occurs on intrusive igneous rocks for the most part. Once these igneous rocks are uplifted and exposed at the surface, as the image on the bottom is showing you, this usually again happens by the erosion of the overlying material. But once it's exposed at the surface, there is a huge release of pressure on those igneous rocks, which used to be confined by the overlying rocks. By the pressure release or decrease, the outer parts of the igneous body will expand, as you're seeing in the picture. So now they're being free to sort of stretch out because they lack confinement. The inner part of the body, though, does not expand and is still confined by the outer edges of the same intrusive body. So now that the outer parts have started to stretch out, their size is different between the outer parts and the inside of the rock body, which causes joints in between the inner and outer part. And so these joints make out the outer edges to get loose and usually fall away. So because it only affects the outsides of that intrusive body, only sheet-like features begin to fall, kind of like slabs, if you would. So that makes the process be called sheeting. A similar process occurs by human action. For example, when we release overlying pressure in open pit mining, or even in underground mining, when we cut the new tunnels. So it's been seen a lot, for example, in underground mining, that after that tunnel has been cut, there's big, the rock on the sides of the tunnel dislodges itself many times because of this release in pressure, and hence the expanding of the surrounding rock, just the outer edges of it, so it dislodges from the rest of it. So this is just a little side note. Realize that the fracturing can also occur after magma or lava crystallizes, like in the columnar basalts, for example, that we looked at in the last chapter, in chapter 5. So in these cases, when fracturing occurs after lava or magma crystallize, the fracturing is caused by contraction rather than expansion, as is the case in this scenario. So fracturing can occur by expansion or contraction depending on the setting and the process that is taking place. All right, so lastly, for mechanical weathering or physical weathering, some organisms may also accomplish weathering, including burrowing animals, plants, and humans. Plant roots in search of nutrients and water actually grow into the fractures of rocks, and as the root grows, so do the fractures. And the making of further fractures increases as well, so the fragmentation process is enhanced. Burrowing animals further break down the rock by moving fresh material to the surface, so by erosion as the process is, where so when they move these sediments, this breakdown rock to the surface, other physical and chemical processes can affect it more easily and attack it. Also, humans contribute greatly to mechanical weathering by blasting of rock in search of minerals, for example, when we mine. When we plow the soils, we're also causing weathering. When we build houses, we're also causing weathering. And simply by stepping on any soil or any rock, I should say, we are potentially weakening the rock, and then this rock may fracture due to the constant stepping on it. So, as humans, we create a lot of weathering and also erosion that is consequent. All right, so now we will look at chemical weathering. Again, chemical weathering is the decomposition of rocks, the chemical alteration of the internal structure of the pre-existing rocks by either adding or removing elements from it. It typically decomposes best by the weakening of the outer exposed surfaces of those rocks, okay, because of the agents that aid in this chemical weathering. We'll talk first about the importance of water in the environment, and here we'll talk about oxidation and carbonic rain. And then we'll talk a little bit about weathering of silicate minerals and spheroidal weathering, which is a type of weathering or the appearance of weathering. All right, so water is by far the most important agent of chemical weathering. Although pure water is non-reactive, meaning H2O, a small amount of dissolved material is generally all that is needed to activate it as a chemical weathering agent. Water typically carries many dissolved ions in it, as we will cover in chapter 13. And some of these dissolved ions react with the rock's minerals that said water is in contact with, and hence changing the overall internal chemistry. Okay, so now let's discuss oxidation. Oxidation, or as some of you may know, rusting, occurs when a material containing some iron in it is exposed to oxygen. The first chemical reaction that you see in the slide is how that process occurs. So 4 iron atoms join with 6 oxygen atoms to create hematite, which is a type of iron oxide that we saw in lab during the minerals lab. If you guys remember, it was kind of brownish red, and it had a brownish and red streak. So that is the result of these chemical weathering action of oxidation. We say that the iron gets oxidized because it lost its valence electron to the oxygen. So the oxygen gained them, and hence it became oxidized. Although the oxidation of iron happens slowly under dry conditions, it is greatly sped up by the addition of water. Oxidation has a great effect in the second chemical reaction above as well. So pyrite, which is FeS2, pyrite is a typical mineral that we find in association with mining operations. So pyrite will combine with some oxygen as well as any water that is flowing through, and it will create an iron hydroxide and also sulfuric acid, which is that H2SO4. So the sulfuric acid, along with the iron oxide that is produced, are what we call acid mine drainage.